storm was closing in, the trail disappearing by the minute, and any sensible person would have kept moving. When John Mercer hears a sound that doesn't belong to the wind, knowing one mistake could cost him his life, he should have run. Instead, he followed a sound that didn't belong to the wind. What he found made his breath catch. A bobcat, half buried in crimson snow, her shoulder torn open, her body failing. Her ears flattened, teeth bared, yet she didn't strike. She couldn't. One leg lay twisted, a deep gash pulsing red against the white ground. John saw a creature losing her fight with death. With numb hands and a pounding heart, he knelt in the howling storm and did what no one would ever believe. He treated her wounds. But 5 years later, something impossible happened. Something that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about wild animals. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. John Mercer never thought of himself as brave. He was the kind of man who wore the same weathered jacket for 10 winters because it still had his wife sewing along the cuff. The kind of man who saved glass jars because they might come in handy. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice, not because he couldn't, but because after you've spent years listening to sick neighbors breathe shallowly on your kitchen couch, you learn that calm can be a kind of medicine. In the foothills outside a small town in western Montana, people didn't call John Doctor. He wasn't one. They called him John, and sometimes, when nobody else was around, that herb man, or the old healer. He grew medicinal plants in a sun-baked patch behind his cabin. Yarrow, mullein, echinacea, plantain, and bitter roots he swore by. He made salves for cracked hands and teas for coughs. He'd walk the creek beds and ridgelines with a canvas bag, collecting what the mountains offered because he believed the land gave back if you treated it with respect. John lived alone now. 5 years earlier, he'd buried the person who made the cabin feel warm, even when the stove went cold. Ellen Mercer had been the gentle kind of stubborn. Sweet until you told her she couldn't do something, and then she'd do it twice just to prove she could. Cancer didn't care about stubbornness. It took her all the same. After Ellen died, John stayed put. Partly because his roots were here, mostly because the town still needed him. When the mill shut down, people lost insurance. When winter storms came, roads closed, and the closest clinic was an hour away. John never pretended herbs could fix everything. But he could help a fever break. He could soothe a throat so someone could sleep. He could make a poultice that took the sting out of a swollen knee. And for some folks, that meant the difference between coping and crumbling. So even in late 2007, when the first real snow of the season came early and heavy, John still headed into the mountains. He told himself it would be a quick trip. 1 day, maybe 2. He wanted fireweed seed and some spruce tips, a few last roots before the ground locked solid. He watched the sky that morning, steel gray, low, heavy, and felt the old warning in his bones. But he also felt the other thing, the familiar pull of responsibility. There were 2 older women in town with lingering coughs. A veteran whose hands cracked and bled every winter. A young mother who'd asked John, quietly and embarrassed, if he had anything for her son's earache because she couldn't afford another urgent care bill. John packed his bag, tightened his boots, and left while the daylight still looked decent. By noon, the weather turned mean. Snow came down in thick sheets, big flakes that looked soft until they hit your face like cold grit. The wind rose, pushing the world sideways. Pine branches bowed under sudden weight. The trail John knew like the lines in his hands started to disappear in white. He should have turned back then. He did not. Because somewhere in that storm, John heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A cry, thin, rough, and full of pain. At first he thought it was a bird, then a fox. But it came again, sharper now, and John stopped so abruptly his boots slid. The sound came from the brush just off the trail where snow had piled into drifts. John stepped carefully, using a walking stick to test the ground. The wind tugged at his hood. His cheeks burned with cold. He pushed aside a branch and saw a shape that made his breath catch. A bobcat lay half buried in snow, her spotted coat clumped dark with blood. One foreleg was twisted awkwardly. A gash ran along her shoulder, deep enough that John could see torn muscle beneath the fur. Her sides heaved as she tried to breathe, and every breath came with that raw, rasping cry. She was alive, but barely. 100 thoughts hit John all at once. Wild, dangerous, rabies, claws, teeth. And then another thought, quieter but heavier. If I walk away, she dies. John had treated injured wildlife before, mostly small things. An owl with a broken wing he'd driven to a licensed rehabilitator. A fawn tangled in barbed wire, freed and left trembling but standing. He respected wild animals the way you respect a river in spring. You don't underestimate it, and you don't get careless. But this bobcat wasn't threatening him. She wasn't even trying to stand. She was simply losing. John's heart hammered as he crouched at a distance, speaking softly. Not because he thought she understood words, but because his voice kept him steady. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy, girl." Her ears flattened. Her lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth, but there was no strength behind it. She tried to lift her head and failed. John's hands shook with more than cold. He did something he'd never admit to anyone later. He prayed. Not for a miracle, just for guidance. Then he reached into his bag. John carried dried meat for himself, a few strips of jerky. He broke off a piece and placed it on the snow a few feet from her mouth. She didn't move. He took a shallow tin from his kit, used for mixing salve, and poured a small amount of water from his canteen. Into that water, he crumbled something most people would never expect a quiet herb man to carry. A pinch of valerian and skullcap, herbs that could calm and slightly sedate when used carefully. He wasn't trying to knock her out. He wasn't trying to drug a wild animal into submission. He was trying to take the edge off panic, because panic made animals fight, and fighting would tear those wounds wider. John pushed the tin toward her with the tip of his stick, then backed away and waited. The bobcat's nose twitched. She licked the snow once, then again, tasting the water. Hunger and thirst beat fear, just barely. She drank, slowly, her tongue trembling. Then she took the jerky in weak bites. John waited until her eyes softened slightly, until her muscles seemed less tight. Then he moved. He didn't touch her head. He didn't loom. He stayed low and angled his body sideways, the way you approach something that might bolt. John had clean cloth in his pack and a small bottle of diluted antiseptic. His fingers went numb as he poured it gently over the wound. The bobcat flinched hard, pain snapping her awake, then sagged again, exhausted. Blood seeped into the snow, a terrible bright red against white. "Hold on," John whispered. "Just hold on." He cleaned as carefully as he could, his breath fogging. He used pressure to slow the bleeding, then reached for a bundle of crushed plantain and yarrow, herbs he trusted for their ability to help stop bleeding and reduce inflammation. He packed the mixture gently into the worst part of the gash, then covered it with cloth. The foreleg worried him most. If it was broken badly, she might never hunt again. But John knew something else. Right now, she didn't need a perfect fix. She needed a chance to survive the next hour. He wrapped the leg as best he could with a splint made from 2 thin branches. Then he stepped back. The storm was getting worse. John's own fingers burned with the warning of frostbite. He couldn't carry a bobcat miles down a disappearing trail. Even if he tried, he might die out here with her. So John did what felt like the cruelest kindness. He took a small tarp from his bag, shoved it under a cluster of low branches, and created a shallow shelter against the wind. He dragged snow in front like a partial wall, leaving space for air. He tucked the bobcat deeper beneath the branches using his stick and the tarp, never fully lifting her, never putting his hands too close to her mouth. Then he left a second strip of jerky near her, and the tin where she could lick snow melt. He hesitated, looking at her one last time. Her eyes were half-lidded now. Not asleep, not peaceful, just barely hanging on. "I'm sorry," he said, voice thick. "That's all I've got today." And then he did something else that was very John Mercer. He told no one. He returned to town that night soaked, exhausted, and quiet, and when neighbors asked why his hands were wrapped, he said he'd slipped on ice. The storm raged for 2 days. John thought about the bobcat every hour. He imagined her dead under those branches. He imagined her suffering alone. He told himself he did what he could. He told himself wild animals died all the time. He told himself again and again that he wasn't God. Still, when the sky finally cleared, John drove back up as far as his old truck could go, then hiked the rest. He found the shelter. The tarp was still there. The snow wall had partially collapsed. But the bobcat was gone. There was blood on the cloth, dark and crusted. There were drag marks, and then paw prints leading away, faint but real. John stood there a long time, feeling something strange in his chest. Half relief, half grief, half wonder. He never saw her again. Not that winter, not the next. Life did what life always does. It kept moving. John kept gathering herbs. He kept tending his neighbors. His hair turned a little whiter. His hands grew a little stiffer. Some nights he sat on the porch alone and listened to coyotes yip across the valley and wondered if Ellen could hear them wherever she was. Then, 5 years later, winter returned with teeth. In late November of 2012, John decided to go up again, just before the worst snow came. He wasn't as young as he used to be. His knees ached more. But he knew the mountains, and he knew what he needed. One last trip for medicine before the roads became unreliable. The morning started clear. By afternoon, it turned deadly. A blizzard rolled in fast, the kind that swallows landmarks and makes every tree look the same. Wind slammed into the ridgeline like a freight train. Snow filled the air so thick it felt like swimming. John tried to turn back. He misjudged a slope, slid, and fell hard. His pack tumbled. When he stood, dizzy and aching, he realized something that made his stomach drop. He didn't know where he was. The trail was gone. The sky was a spinning sheet of white. John pushed forward anyway, choosing a direction and praying it was down. The wind fought him. The cold dug into him. Snow crusted on his eyebrows and lashes. He walked until his legs felt like stone. Then he walked some more. When night fell, he found a shallow depression between two boulders and curled into it, pulling his jacket tight. He had no fire. His matches were damp. He had a little water, but not much. He had eaten most of his food earlier, thinking he'd be home by dark. All night he listened to the wind and tried not to think about how quiet the world gets when it's deciding whether you live. By the second day, John's thoughts slowed. He moved like a man underwater. His hands didn't feel like hands. They felt like distant objects attached to him. His mouth was dry. He tried to chew snow but knew it would only chill him further. He kept walking. He kept falling. By the third day, John wasn't sure if he was walking at all or just dreaming that he was. He remembers collapsing near a small stand of evergreens. He remembers his eyes closing. He remembers thinking, oddly calm, "Ellen, I'm coming." And then he felt something. Warmth. Not the imagined warmth of memory, but real warmth pressing against his side. John's eyes opened a crack. At first, he thought it was a dog, a neighbor's dog, a hallucination. Then he saw the short tail, the tufted ears, the spotted coat, a bobcat. She was larger than the one he remembered, healthier, thick winter fur, strong shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, golden, and fixed on him with something John could not explain. Recognition. The bobcat moved closer, not aggressive, not afraid. She pressed her body against him, sharing heat the way animals do when survival is the only rule. Then she shifted, placing herself slightly upwind, blocking the worst of the gusts. John couldn't speak. His lips were cracked. His tongue felt too big for his mouth. He blinked slowly, trying to understand. The bobcat stayed. When John drifted into a thin, freezing sleep, she remained pressed close. When he shivered violently, she adjusted, keeping contact. John's mind floated in and out of awareness, and in those moments he saw her moving away, then returning. At one point, he heard a fluttering sound, wings beating in panic. Later, he smelled something metallic and alive. When he opened his eyes again, there, on the snow near his hand, lay a pheasant, freshly killed. John stared at it, not believing. The bobcat sat a few feet away, watching him. Not watching like prey. Watching like a guard. John's shaking hands moved slowly. He tore a piece of meat free with numb fingers and forced himself to chew. It felt like swallowing gravel, but it was food. It was life. The bobcat didn't take the pheasant back. She didn't rush him. She simply waited until he ate enough to stop the dizzy spinning in his head. Then she stood, turned her head, and walked a few steps away, pausing to look back at him. The message was clear. Follow. John couldn't stand fully, but he crawled, then stumbled, then staggered. The bobcat moved ahead in short bursts, never too far, always checking back. When John collapsed again, she returned to press warmth into his side. Hours passed like this, maybe more. John lost track of time. Eventually, he noticed something different in the wind, a slight break, a faint smell of smoke. Or maybe it was his imagination. Then he saw it. A cabin. Small, gray, half buried in snow, but solid. Real. John didn't know how he got there, only that he fell against the door and pounded weakly until it opened. A man stood in the doorway, eyes wide. He looked like the kind of person who lived far from town on purpose. Lean, weathered, hair gone mostly white under a knit cap. A rifle hung on a peg behind him, but his hands were empty. "Good Lord," the man breathed. "You're frozen." John tried to speak and couldn't. The man dragged him inside, shut the door, and got him near a stove. He wrapped him in blankets, pressed warm water to his lips, and worked with the quick, practiced calm of someone who'd seen winter try to kill before. John's eyes kept drifting to the window, because outside, just beyond the glass, the Bobcat sat in the snow, watching. The cabin man followed John's gaze, and something softened in his expression. "Her," he murmured. "So she found you." John's throat worked. "You know her?" The man nodded slowly, almost like he was talking about an old friend. "Name's Wade," he said. "And yeah, I know her. I raised her." John blinked, stunned. Wade poured something warm into a mug and helped John drink. 5, 6 years back," Wade continued, "I found her as a kitten, orphaned, half-starved, crying so loud I thought it was a squeaky toy at first." He gave a brief, humorless chuckle. "I called a rehabber friend of mine, did it right, kept her safe, fed her proper, minimized contact when she got older, worked hard to make sure she stayed wild enough to survive." John's voice came out as a rasp. "Then why is she so close to people?" Wade glanced at the window again. "She's not close to people. She's close to 2 people. Me, and apparently you." John stared, heart pounding with something that felt like awe. Wade continued quietly. "I released her when she was ready, but she stayed near this ridge, kept her territory close. Some animals do that if the release spot's good and they're strong. She doesn't come inside, doesn't take food from my hand, but she watches. And sometimes, when the weather gets bad, she's out there like she's counting the world." John swallowed hard. "I helped one years ago, wounded, in a storm." Wade's eyes sharpened. "Shoulder injury?" John's breath caught. "Yes." Wade nodded once, slow. "Then it was her. She came back with that bandage half hanging off, smelling like yarrow and antiseptic. I about fell over when I saw it. Thought somebody was trying to trap her, but she wasn't afraid. Just tired. I got a look at the wound later. You cleaned it, packed it, bought her time." John stared at the mug in his hands like it might explain what was happening. Wade leaned back, voice low. "Bobcats aren't pets. They don't do gratitude like a dog. They don't wag their tail and forgive the world. But they remember. They learn. And if you show them one clear thing, mercy without trapping them, sometimes it sticks." Outside, the Bobcat rose and moved closer to the cabin, sitting just under the window again. John's eyes filled without warning. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but something about the idea, something wild and fierce, remembering a single act of kindness through 5 harsh winters, broke him open. Wade watched him, then looked away, giving him privacy. "She's been restless the last couple days," he said softly, like she knew something was coming. John whispered, "She saved me." Wade nodded. "Looks like she did." That night, John slept near the stove, wrapped in blankets. His body hurt in ways he'd deal with later, but he was alive, He could feel warmth again. That was enough. In the morning, the storm eased. The sky turned pale blue, the kind of cold that glitters. John and Wade stepped outside. The bobcat stood a short distance away, not close enough to touch, not close enough to be tame, but close enough to be unmistakably present. John's heart beat hard. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. He only placed something on the snow, half of the remaining pheasant meat Wade had cooked for him, set down as an offering, not a lure. Then he stepped back. The bobcat watched him for a long moment. Her ears flicked. Her nose tested the air. And then, so subtle John almost missed it, she blinked slowly. A calm, deliberate closing of her eyes. Not surrender. Not affection the way humans demand it. Something else. A quiet acknowledgement. Then she turned and slipped into the trees, her body melting into the landscape like she'd always belonged there. Wade drove John down the mountain later that day, and when John finally made it back to town, people shook their heads and scolded him and hugged him too hard. John told them he'd gotten lost. He did not tell them the rest. Because some things sound like stories people won't believe, and John was tired of arguing with the world about what was real. But after that, whenever John went up to gather medicine, carefully, with better preparation, never alone in risky weather, he sometimes felt eyes on him at the edge of the timberline. Sometimes he saw a flick of a bobbed tail. Sometimes, from a ridge, he'd glimpse a spotted shape sitting still as stone, watching him not with hunger, not with fear, but with a kind of measured recognition. John never followed her, never called to her, never tried to make her into something she wasn't. He just nodded to the trees, as if greeting an old neighbor. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt sharp and cold and lonely, John would think about how mercy moves through the wilderness. How a single act, done without audience or reward, can come back years later as warmth pressed against your ribs when you're sure the mountain has claimed you. He'd think about Ellen too, about how she used to say, "Kindness isn't wasted, John. It just takes its time coming back." And each time he stepped out of the woods and headed home with a bag of healing plants for his neighbors, John carried something else with him, invisible but heavy as a blessing. The knowledge that somewhere out there, a wild bobcat remembered him. Not as a hero, not as a master, just as a man who once in a storm chose not to walk away.